I arrived at my lake cabin expecting a quiet meeting, only to find an HOA woman forcing her way inside, loudly accusing me of violating community rules, ignoring neighbors telling her she had the wrong place, brushing off every warning as she marched in uninvited and started documenting violations, completely unaware that the person she had just interrupted wasn't a homeowner trying to dodge rules but the state attorney general, who was already sitting inside waiting for me. So before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. I arrived at my lake cabin expecting a quiet, private meeting, the kind where serious conversations happen behind closed doors and away from distractions, only to find an HOA woman forcing her way inside, loudly accusing me of violating community rules, ignoring neighbors telling her she had the wrong place, brushing off every warning as she marched in uninvited and started documenting so-called violations, completely unaware that the person she had just interrupted was not a homeowner trying to dodge rules but the state attorney general, who was already sitting inside waiting for me. The lake was calm that morning, the water perfectly still, reflecting the sky like glass, which made the raised voices near my cabin feel even more out of place than they already were. I had chosen that location specifically because it was quiet, private, and legally separate from the HOA's jurisdiction, a place where conversations could happen without interruption or unnecessary attention. As I pulled up and stepped out of my vehicle, I immediately sensed something was wrong, because a small group of neighbors had gathered near my porch, their body language tense, their voices low but urgent. At the center of it all was a woman I did not recognize, standing squarely in my doorway as if she belonged there, holding a clipboard and a phone, speaking loudly enough for everyone around to hear. She was talking about violations, compliance, and enforcement, using the kind of confident tone that assumes authority rather than proves it. I watched for a moment before intervening, trying to understand how someone could be so comfortable standing inside a home that clearly was not hers. One of the neighbors noticed me and quietly said my name, relief evident in his voice, but the woman did not turn around. She continued speaking, narrating into her phone as she stepped farther into the cabin, pointing at fixtures, windows, and furniture, as though she were conducting an inspection she had every right to perform. Another neighbor told her again, firmly this time, that she needed to stop and leave immediately because this was private property and she was trespassing. She dismissed him without hesitation, waving her hand as if brushing away an inconvenience, and said that HOA authority extended to all properties in the community, regardless of what anyone thought they knew. That was the first clear sign that this was not a misunderstanding, but a pattern. She had convinced herself that confidence was the same thing as permission. I stepped closer and asked her what she thought she was doing, keeping my voice calm and controlled, because situations like this tend to escalate quickly when emotion replaces clarity. She finally turned toward me, looked me up and down briefly, and said that she was enforcing community standards and documenting violations, as if that explanation alone settled the matter. I told her plainly that she was inside my cabin without permission and needed to leave immediately. She smiled in a way that suggested she had heard that sentence many times before and never once taken it seriously. She said that residents always say that when they are caught breaking rules and that cooperation would make things easier for everyone involved. The neighbors spoke up again, one after another, telling her she was wrong, telling her she was overstepping, telling her that she needed to leave before this became something serious. Phones came out, not out of excitement, but out of instinct. Because people know when a line has been crossed and want proof when denial inevitably follows. She did not stop recording. She did not lower her voice. She took another step. Inside. That was the moment I told her very clearly that she was interrupting a scheduled legal meeting and that she needed to leave now. She laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said that HOA enforcement did not pause for private meetings. She had no idea how wrong she was. Inside the cabin, seated calmly at the table, was the state attorney general, reviewing documents we had planned to discuss in private. He had heard everything. He stood slowly, not with anger, but with the kind of composure that comes from knowing exactly where authority actually resides. The woman was still speaking when he appeared in her line of sight, still listing violations, still convinced she was in control of the situation. It took a few seconds for her to register that someone else was there, and when she finally did, she barely glanced at him before continuing her explanation, assuming he was just another person she could talk over. That assumption lasted only moments. The Attorney General introduced himself calmly and asked her if she understood that she had unlawfully entered a private residence and disrupted an official legal meeting. The words seemed to hit her all at once, and her expression changed instantly, confidence giving way to confusion, then disbelief. She asked him to repeat himself. He did, this time showing his credentials. The porch fell silent. The neighbors stopped talking. The phones remained raised, but no one moved. The woman looked from the credentials to his face, then to me, and back again, as if trying to rearrange reality into something that made sense to her. She began to speak, then stopped, then tried again, offering excuses about enforcement duties and misunderstandings. But the tone she had relied on was gone. The authority she thought she had evaporated the moment real authority entered the conversation. I told her again that she needed to leave. And this time she did not argue. She stepped backwards slowly, as if the space itself had become dangerous, clutching her clipboard, like a shield that no longer worked. What had started as an HOA intrusion had become something far more serious, and everyone present understood that this was only the beginning. The calm lake, the quiet morning, and the private cabin had all been disrupted by someone who believed rules were weapons and confidence was power. They were about to learn the difference. She did not leave immediately, even after being told clearly and directly that she was trespassing, because the idea that she could be wrong seemed more offensive to her than the fact that she was standing inside someone else's home without permission. Instead, she straightened her posture, tightened her grip on the clipboard, and resumed speaking with the same rehearsed confidence, as though repeating the rules loudly enough might somehow make them apply. She explained that the HOA had broad authority, that community standards existed for a reason, and that enforcement did not require consent from residents who were already in violation. She spoke as if these statements were facts rather than assumptions, delivering them with the certainty of someone who had never been challenged in a way that mattered. I watched her closely, not because I was intimidated, but because I had seen this behavior before in other contexts, where confidence was mistaken for legitimacy and repetition was used as a substitute for proof. She moved deeper into the cabin, pointing at windows and exterior doors, claiming improper fixtures and unapproved modifications, none of which were true, and certainly none of which were under HOA jurisdiction. One of the neighbors stepped forward and told her again that the cabin was outside HOA boundaries, and that she had no authority there at all. She dismissed him, instantly saying that HOA authority extended to all properties within visual range of the community, a statement so blatantly incorrect that several people looked at one another in disbelief. She continued recording on her phone, narrating violations into the camera as if documenting evidence for a future confrontation she was certain she would win. Her tone was confident, almost smug, as though she had already decided how this story would end, with fines issued, compliance forced, and another resident put in their place. I told her again, calmly and clearly, that she needed to stop recording and leave immediately, because she was unlawfully inside a private residence. She responded by saying that people always claim trespassing when they know they are in violation, and that cooperation would make things easier for everyone involved. That was the moment it became obvious that she was not listening at all. She was not responding to the situation in front of her, but rather replaying a script that had worked for her in the past. In her mind, every objection was just another excuse, every warning another attempt to delay consequences, and every raised voice proof that she was winning. The neighbors continued to tell her to leave, their voices growing firmer, their patience thinning, but she talked over them, insisting that failure to comply would result in fines, legal action, and further enforcement. She said these things casually, as if threatening people with consequences was simply part of the job. Phones remained raised. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to concern, because everyone present understood that this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was someone asserting power they did not have, in a place they did not belong, while refusing to acknowledge reality. I asked her who had authorized her to enter the cabin. She did not answer the question directly, instead repeating that HOA enforcement did not require prior approval. I asked her again, more directly this time, and she responded by saying that authorization was implied by her role. Implied authority is not authority at all, and that distinction would soon matter. She stepped closer to the table where documents were laid out, glancing at them briefly before turning back to her phone and continuing her narration. That was when I told her, firmly, that she was interfering with a legal meeting and that her presence there was unacceptable. She laughed again dismissively, and said that private meetings did not exempt residents from compliance. She did not realize, or refuse to accept, that this was not a meeting she could interrupt without consequences. The Attorney General remained seated during all of this, observing quietly, allowing her to demonstrate exactly how far she was willing to go. His silence was not hesitation but patience, and when he finally stood, the shift in the room was immediate, even if she did not notice it at first. She continued talking for several seconds after he rose, still focused on her phone, still narrating, still convinced that she was in control. When she finally looked up and saw him standing there, her expression flickered briefly with confusion, but she pressed on anyway, assuming he was just another person she could overpower with volume and certainty. He asked her calmly if she understood that she was unlawfully present in a private residence and interfering with an official legal meeting. She scoffed at first, clearly assuming this was an exaggeration meant to intimidate her, but her confidence faltered when he repeated himself and introduced himself by name and title. For the first time since she arrived, she stopped speaking. The room felt suddenly very small. She looked at his credentials, then at the neighbors on the porch, then back at me, and it was clear that she was trying to recalibrate, to find a way to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond her reach. She attempted to explain herself, stumbling over words, insisting that she had been doing her job, and that there had been a misunderstanding. The problem was that misunderstandings do not involve forced entry, ignored warnings, and refusal to leave when told repeatedly to do so. I told her again to leave the cabin immediately. This time she did not argue. She stepped back toward the door slowly, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by a strained politeness that felt rehearsed and hollow. Outside, the neighbors watched silently as she exited, still holding her clipboard, still clutching the phone she had used to document violations that would now document her own actions instead. She avoided eye contact as she stepped onto the porch, suddenly aware of how many people had seen everything. False authority thrives on silence and compliance, but both had disappeared. And as she left the cabin, it was clear to everyone present that the story was no longer about HOA rules, but about consequences. Even after stepping out of the cabin, even after being told explicitly that she had no authority there, and even after realizing that the situation was far more serious than she had first assumed, the HOA woman did not simply leave the property, because backing down completely would have meant admitting she was wrong. And for someone who relied on confidence as power, that was harder to accept than crossing yet another line. She stopped at the edge of the porch and turned back toward the doorway, still holding her phone up as if it were a shield, continuing to record and narrate despite being told repeatedly that she needed to stop. She spoke loudly, deliberately, ensuring her voice carried to the neighbors who had gathered near her, as though she could still control the story if she framed it aggressively enough. She said that residents often became hostile when confronted with violations, that intimidation tactics were common, and that she was trained to remain firm under pressure. She made these claims while standing on property she had no legal right to be on, recording people without consent, and refusing to disengage when instructed to do so. Several neighbors told her again that she needed to leave immediately, not just the cabin but the entire property, and one of them explained clearly that continuing to remain there after being ordered to leave constituted trespassing. She responded by laughing and saying that people always threaten legal terms when they feel cornered. Phones remained raised. The mood shifted again from disbelief to alarm, because everyone present understood that this was no longer just an HOA overreach, but a person actively refusing to respect clear boundaries. I told her firmly that she needed to stop recording and leave the property immediately, and that any further refusal would result in law enforcement being contacted. She responded by saying that calling the police would only make things worse for everyone involved, a statement that revealed just how confident she was that consequences would never actually apply to her. She took a few steps down from the porch, but instead of leaving, she positioned herself near the walkway, blocking access as if daring someone to challenge her presence. She continued narrating into her phone, describing imagined violations, claiming harassment, and framing herself as the victim of unreasonable homeowners. That behavior was not accidental. It was strategic. She was creating a record, but not for accuracy. She was creating it to control perception. One neighbor told her plainly that she was making the situation worse for hers. Elf. She ignored him. Another asked her to simply leave so everyone could move on. She responded by saying that compliance was always the hardest part for people who thought rules did not apply to them. At that point, the Attorney General stepped forward onto the porch, standing beside me, his presence calm but unmistakable. He told her clearly that she had been instructed to leave private property and that her continued presence constituted unlawful trespass. He explained this without raising his voice, without threat, and without emotion. She attempted to interrupt him. He did not allow it. He finished his statement, looked directly at her, and asked her if she understood what she had just been told. For a moment she hesitated, and it was clear that she was trying to decide whether to comply or to continue pushing, weighing the possibility of losing face against the risk she still did not fully grasp. She chose wrong. She said that she did not recognize his authority to order her off the property and that she would leave when her documentation was complete. That statement marked the exact moment when the situation crossed from reckless into willful. The neighbors reacted immediately. Someone said that she had just admitted to refusing a lawful order. Someone else said that everything was being recorded. The phones moved closer, capturing her words clearly. I told her one last time that she needed to leave now. She responded by pointing her phone at me and accusing me of threatening her. That accusation did not land the way she expected. The Attorney General informed her that law enforcement was being contacted immediately and that her refusal to leave after multiple clear instructions would be included in the report. She suddenly became very still, as if trying to rewind the moment in her mind. She asked if this was really necessary. She said that things had gotten out of hand. She said that she was sure this could be resolved without escalation. The shift was immediate and obvious. Moments earlier she had been confident, loud, and dismissive. Now her voice was lower, her movements more cautious, her tone suddenly cooperative. The authority she had projected evaporated the moment she realized she could not control the outcome. She said she would leave finally, but even then she hesitated, lingering just long enough to look around at the neighbors, the phones, and the cabin behind her, as if searching for a way to reclaim some piece of the narrative. She walked slowly toward the edge of the property, still holding her phone, still recording, even as people told her again to stop. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge wrongdoing. She simply retreated, unwilling to fully accept responsibility. As she reached the boundary line, she turned back one last time and said that this was not over, that the HOA would follow up, and that violations would be addressed. The words sounded hollow, stripped of the confidence they once carried. No one responded. The silence was complete. She left the property at last, disappearing down the path toward the road, her presence fading but the tension she had created still hanging in the air. The neighbors lowered their phones slowly, exchanging looks that communicated relief, disbelief, and anger all at once. The Attorney General turned to me and said quietly that everything had been captured clearly and that there would be consequences. He said that people like her often relied on intimidation because it worked just often enough to go unchallenged, but that this time the record would speak for itself. The lake was still calm. The water had not moved. The quiet returned slowly, as if the environment itself needed time to recover from the intrusion. What she did not realize was that crossing G-lines is easy when no one stops you, but once those lines are documented, witnessed, and acknowledged, there is no way to step back over them without consequence. And this was only the beginning. The moment she turned back toward the cabin after lingering at the edge of the property, still holding her phone and still convinced that she could salvage control through persistence alone, she finally encountered a reality she could not talk over, dismiss, or intimidate, because the man she had interrupted earlier stepped forward fully into view and calmly revealed exactly who he was and why her actions had just crossed from reckless behavior into serious legal trouble. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten her. He did not match her energy at all. He introduced himself clearly, stated his full name, and identified his position as the State Attorney General, explaining in plain language that he had been inside the cabin for a scheduled legal meeting and that her forced entry and continued refusal to leave constituted unlawful intrusion and interference with official business. For a brief moment, she simply stared at him. Her face did not register anger or defiance anymore. It registered confusion, the kind of confusion that appears when someone realizes the story they have been telling themselves cannot coexist with the facts in front of them. She laughed softly at first, a nervous reflex rather than a challenge, and said that people often exaggerated titles to scare HOA representatives into backing down. She said it casually, as if she expected him to smile, clarify, and step aside. He did not. Instead, he reached into his jacket and produced his credentials, holding them at a comfortable distance so she could see them clearly without any sense of confrontation. He explained again who he was, what his role was, and why her presence on the property was not only unauthorized but now formally documented. The change in her posture was immediate. Her shoulders dropped slightly, her grip on the phone loosened, her confidence did not shatter all at once, but it fractured, piece by piece, as the weight of the situation settled in. She looked at the credentials, then at me, then at the neighbors who were still recording, and then back at him again, as if hoping someone would contradict what she was seeing. No one did. She tried to speak, but the words came out disorganized, a mix of half-explanations and excuses about enforcement duties and misunderstandings. She said she had been told the property was subject to HOA oversight. She said she was following procedure. She said she never intended to interrupt anything important. Each sentence weakened her position further. The Attorney General listened without interrupting, allowing her to finish, and then responded calmly that intent did not change the facts, and that her refusal to leave after being clearly instructed to do so had escalated the situation significantly. He explained that her actions were now documented by multiple witnesses and video recordings and that those records would speak for themselves. The neighbors shifted slightly, some stepping closer, others remaining still, but all focused on the exchange unfolding in front of them. Phones remained raised, capturing every word, every pause, every visible crack in her composure. She attempted to regain control by asserting that she was simply doing her job and that HOAs were often misunderstood. She said that enforcement required firmness and that residents frequently tried to avoid compliance by invoking legal threats. He responded by explaining that there was a clear legal distinction between enforcement within lawful boundaries and trespassing on private property, and that her refusal to respect those boundaries after repeated warnings was no longer a matter of misunderstanding. That explanation landed differently than the warnings before it. It was not emotional, it was definitive. She asked if she was being accused of a crime. He answered honestly that her actions raised serious legal concerns and that law enforcement would determine the appropriate response. He did not accuse, he did not speculate. He simply stated what would happen next. Her breathing changed, her voice softened. She asked if this could be resolved without further escalation, a question that stood in sharp contrast to her earlier insistence that she did not need permission or approval to act. The shift was unmistakable. He explained that she had been given multiple opportunities to disengage and leave voluntarily, and that she had refused each one. He said that escalation was not something he had chosen, but something her actions had created. She looked down at the clipboard she was still holding, then slowly lowered it to her side, as if realizing that it no longer represented authority but evidence. She stopped recording on her phone finally and slipped it into her pocket without comment. No one spoke for a moment. The lake remained still. The air felt heavy, not with tension anymore, but with inevitability. She asked what she should do now. He told her to leave the property immediately and to refrain from any further contact until advised otherwise. He told her that law enforcement would follow up and that any attempt to retaliate or reframe the incident would only compound the situation. She nodded, slowly, her movements careful and restrained, as though sudden motion might make things worse. She turned toward the road without saying anything else. No longer narrating, no longer posturing, no longer pretending this was just another routine enforcement. As she walked away, the neighbors watched quietly. No one cheered, no one mocked. The satisfaction came not from humiliation but from clarity. Once she was gone, the Attorney General turned back toward the cabin and said that everything necessary had been recorded and that the matter would be addressed formally. He said that situations like this often relied on intimidation and silence to continue unchecked, but that documentation changed everything. The neighbors began to disperse slowly, talking quietly among themselves, already aware that this incident would not be forgotten or brushed aside. Phones were lowered, but the videos remained. Inside the cabin, the door was closed again, restoring the privacy that had been violated, though the sense of intrusion lingered. The meeting resumed, but the tone had shifted, grounded now in the understanding that the events outside would have consequences beyond the property line. The reveal had not been dramatic in the way movies portray such moments. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements, just the quiet collapse of false authority when confronted with the truth, and that truth, once spoken and witnessed, could not be undone. The reality of what had just happened did not strike her all at once. Because people who rely on authority they do not truly possess rarely accept its collapse in a single moment, and instead experience it in slow, unsettling waves as each assumption they depended on quietly fails. As she walked away from the cabin and down toward the road, her steps slowed, not because anyone stopped her, but because the confidence that had carried her onto the property no longer existed. Every few seconds she glanced back, not in defiance but in disbelief, as if hoping the scene behind her would somehow rewrite itself into something less damaging. The neighbors remained silent, not out of fear but out of understanding that the moment no longer required commentary. The phones that had captured everything were still in their hands, and the knowledge that the footage existed was enough. Inside the cabin, the Attorney General sat down and placed his folder the table, his expression calm but focused. He explained that this incident was no longer just about an overzealous HOA representative, but about unlawful entry, refusal to leave private property, and interference with a scheduled legal meeting. Each of those facts stood on its own, but together they formed a clear pattern. He explained that people often misunderstood authority, mistaking proximity to power for power itself, and that HOAs were particularly vulnerable to this problem because enforcement roles attracted individuals who confused rules with control. He said that the law was very clear about where such authority ended, and that this woman had crossed those boundaries repeatedly and knowingly. Outside, word was already spreading. One neighbor was on the phone, quietly explaining what had happened to someone else in the community. Another neighbor was uploading video footage, not to shame but to preserve the truth before it could be altered or denied. The atmosphere had shifted from shock to resolve. What the HOA woman did not realize was that her earlier behavior, the loud narration, the refusal to leave, and the dismissive comments about legal consequences, had all been recorded clearly. There were timestamps, there were witnesses, there were multiple angles. There was no version of events left that she could control. Law enforcement arrived later, not with urgency but with professionalism, responding to a report that was already thoroughly documented. The officers spoke first with the Attorney General, reviewed the footage, and took statements from the neighbors who had remained. Each account aligned, each detail matched. When they contacted the HOA woman by phone, her tone was different than it had been earlier. She no longer sounded certain. She asked questions instead of making demands. She attempted to clarify rather than assert. The officer explained to her that she was being investigated for trespassing and that her refusal to leave after being instructed to do so would be included in the report. He explained that recording on private property after being told to stop was also under review. He spoke plainly, without accusation, and without drama. She asked if this would go on her record. That question answered everything. The authority she had claimed moments earlier had vanished completely, replaced by concern for personal consequences she had clearly never considered before. The rules she once insisted were more important than people suddenly mattered very much when they applied to her. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting that evening, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Emails circulated rapidly, using cautious language and carefully chosen words, acknowledging an incident and promising a full review. No one mentioned the Attorney General by name in writing, but everyone understood the gravity of what had happened. The board members were not angry at the woman who had caused the problem. They were afraid of the exposure. They understood that this was not a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with apologies or procedural changes. This was a documented violation of law involving a high-ranking state official, witnessed by multiple residents, and recorded from beginning to end. Inside the cabin, the meeting resumed, but the conversation now included next steps related to the incident. The Attorney General explained that his office would not pursue anything out of spite, but that accountability mattered, especially when private organizations attempted to exercise authority they did not legally possess. He said that unchecked behavior became normalized when no one pushed back, and that moments like this forced necessary boundaries to be reaffirmed. The neighbors felt a quiet sense of validation. For years, many of them had experienced smaller versions of the same behavior. Aggressive notices, unannounced inspections, veiled threats of fines. They had complied because resisting felt exhausting and risky. This time, someone had pushed back with clarity and the law behind him. The HOA woman, meanwhile, spent the evening calling board members, attempting to explain her actions. Her explanations shifted depending on who she spoke to. Sometimes she said she believed she had authority. Other times she said she misunderstood the boundaries. At least once, she suggested that residents had provoked her. None of those explanations mattered anymore. The footage did not change. The witnesses did not change. The facts did not change. By the next morning, she had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The HOA released a statement emphasizing that her actio NS did not reflect their values and that enforcement protocols were being reviewed. The language was careful, distant, and clearly designed to limit liability. Residents read the statement quietly. Some saved it. Some printed it. They understood that this was not closure but confirmation. Reality had set in not just for one woman, but for an entire system that had relied on silence and compliance to operate unchecked. The power dynamic had shifted permanently, and there was no way to reverse it. The lake remained calm that morning, reflecting the sky as if nothing had happened, but the community understood that something fundamental had changed. Authority had been tested, and it had failed where it did not belong. The aftermath did not arrive with sirens or headlines because consequences like these rarely announce themselves loudly and instead unfold quietly, methodically, and in ways that permanently alter how power is exercised and remembered. In the days following the incident at the lake cabin, the community changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations that once happened in whispers were now spoken openly. Neighbors who had rarely questioned HOA authority began sharing stories of their own encounters, many of them describing the same patterns of intimidation, overreach, and dismissal that had been on full display that afternoon. The difference now was that those stories were no longer isolated complaints. They were part of a documented pattern. The HOA board's emergency meeting did not resolve the issue, but it revealed something important. For the first time, enforcement was no longer being discussed as a matter of procedure alone, but as a matter of legal exposure. Board members spoke carefully, choosing words that acknowledged mistakes without admitting liability. But the shift in tone was unmistakable. They were no longer confident. They were cautious. The woman at the center of the incident did not return to her role. Officially, she was placed on extended administrative leave pending review, but unofficially, everyone understood that her authority was finished. She no longer attended meetings, no longer sent notices, and no longer appeared at properties with a clipboard and phone. Her silence spoke louder than any apology could have. Legal correspondence followed. Letters were exchanged. Requests for documentation were made and fulfilled. The video footage captured by neighbors became part of a formal record, preserved exactly as it had been recorded, without edits, filters, or commentary. There was no room for reinterpretation. The Attorney General's office, CE, reviewed the matter thoroughly, not with the intent to punish, but with the intent to establish clear boundaries that could not be ignored again. The conclusion was simple and definitive. The HOA representative had acted outside her authority, had trespassed on private property, and had refused lawful instructions to leave. Those facts were not disputed, they were confirmed. As a result, the HOA was required to revise its enforcement policies, retrain its representatives, and implement strict protocols regarding property access, resident interaction, and escalation procedures. These changes were not optional, they were conditions. The board agreed they had no alternative. For the residents, the changes were immediate and noticeable. Notices became less aggressive. Inspections required prior written consent. Enforcement communication shifted from demands to requests. The tone that had once relied on intimidation was replaced with professionalism. It was not kindness, it was accountability. The community meetings that followed were well attended. Residents asked questions. They requested transparency. They demanded clarification about where HOA authority began and ended. For the first time, the board answered carefully, knowing that vague language would no longer be accepted. Trust, once broken, does not return easily, but boundaries, once established, can prevent future harm. The lake cabin itself returned to being what it had always been intended to be, a quiet place for reflection and work, undisturbed by intrusion. The incident was not erased from memory, but it no longer hovered over the property like a threat. It had been addressed, it had been resolved. The Attorney General later remarked privately that moments like these mattered not because of who was involved, but because of what they revealed. He said that authority, when left unchecked, always expands beyond its limits, and that the law existed not to empower the loudest voice, but to protect the quietest ones. Those words stayed with the neighbors. They understood now that compliance was not the same as obligation, and that questioning authority was not defiance when it was grounded in the law. The fear that had once kept people silent had been replaced with something stronger: clarity. The HOA woman eventually moved away from the community, No announcement was made, no explanation was offered. She simply disappeared from the neighborhood, her presence reduced to a memory and a cautionary example. No one celebrated her departure. They did not need to. The lesson had already been learned. Months later, when new residents moved into the community, they were greeted not with warnings but with information. Neighbors explained the rules clearly, honestly, and without intimidation. They also explained rights. That balance mattered. The incident became a reference point, not as gossip, but as a reminder of what happened when power was challenged with truth instead of fear. It was not retold to glorify confrontation, but to emphasize restraint, accountability, and the importance of knowing where authority ends. In the end, there was no dramatic finale, no courtroom spectacle, no public apology, just a quiet, permanent shift, the kind that lasts. The lake remained calm, reflecting the sky as it always had, but the community that lived beside it was no longer the same. It was stronger, more informed, and less willing to surrender its rights to anyone holding a clipboard and a sense of entitlement. And that was the real outcome. Because sometimes the good guys do not win by force or volume, but by standing still, telling the truth, and letting the law do exactly what it was designed to do.